I was at a high-end bouldering gym last week, watching a guy who seemed to embody the modern ideal. He was in peak physical condition, wearing expensive technical gear, and his grooming was, frankly, flawless. He climbed with a robotic, solitary precision. When a group of young women nearby tried to strike up a casual conversation, he didn't even look over. He wasn't being rude, he just seemed entirely biologically indifferent. He finished his set, checked a notification on his phone, some algorithmic feed of market data, and drifted out the door without acknowledging a single human soul. He looked exactly like what biologist John Calhoun described in his infamous Universe 25 experiment from 1972. In that study, when a population reached a certain density and the social hierarchy fractured, a class of males emerged called the beautiful ones. They did nothing but eat, sleep, and groom themselves. They abandoned all competition, all mating rituals, and all social conflict. They were the healthiest, most perfect specimens in the colony, and yet they were the primary drivers of its total extinction. What I realized watching him is that the current 2025 data isn't just showing us a dating slump or a political divide among Gen Z. We are witnessing the first human-scale behavioral sink. While one half of the generation is retreating into a digital world of hyperinflated expectations and choice paralysis, the other half is performing a silent, calculated withdrawal from the social contract entirely. It is a world where the sexual Gini coefficient has reached a terminal breaking point. This isn't a story about people failing to find love. It's a story about a generation that has looked at the cost-benefit analysis of modern relationships and decided that nonviolent non-cooperation is the only winning move. But why has the human mating algorithm suddenly glitched so violently? And what happens to a civilization when its beautiful ones decide that the game is so rigged they'd rather just stop playing?
That image you just painted, that guy in the gym, that's the absolute core of what we need to talk about today. It's that that calculated, almost clinical indifference.
Right. It wasn't emotional, it was strategic.
Exactly. Viewing human connection as an inefficiency, or worse, a risk. It perfectly distills this systemic rupture we're seeing in modern relational life.
Okay, so let's really unpack this. The mission for this deep dive is to get past that one frankly chilling anecdote and figure out if this cold, rational withdrawal is actually calculated response.
Strategic response.
To a systemic failure in how we connect with each other, especially in, these technologically rich societies we live in. We're trying to understand the logic.
Precisely. We're explicitly not framing this as some kind of moral failing or a simple psychological crisis.
No.
We're examining the evidence that suggests this individual choice is actually a rational, almost game-theoretic response to systems, economic, legal, technological, that have made traditional human connection overwhelmingly costly.
And volatile.
And incredibly volatile.
That is just a staggering claim. The idea that optimizing for your own survival now means opting out of the most fundamental human contracts. So how are we going to structure this? How do we build that case?
We've broken it down into 4 key phases. First, we have to start with the pure economic calculus. The hyperinflation of the dating market, this idea of a liquidity trap, but for marriage, and the very measurable financial risks involved.
Okay, it's the hard numbers.
Then second, we pivot to the psychological escape. This is where things like AI companions and digital arbitrage come in, these supernormal stimuli.
The easy way out, basically.
Or the efficient way out. Third, we zoom way out to the sociological scale. We have to talk about John Calhoun's mouse utopia because the parallels are just chilling, the behavioral sink.
Right.
And finally, we'll look at the strategic responses. What are people actually doing about this, both on an individual level with philosophies like monk mode and on a systemic level with the advanced algorithms that platforms are building to try and, rescue the entire market?
We have to start with the money in the market then, because this framework, liquidity traps, arbitrage, it strips away all the romance and just leaves you with a cold, hard cost-benefit analysis.
It does.
So why is the modern dating market being seen, especially by so many men, as this rigged negative-sum game?
Well, the foundational issue is the distortion. The distortion created by digital platforms. I mean, before the internet, your dating market was your town, your social circle.
Right, geographically limited.
It was high friction, but it was low volume. Digital platforms came along and promised to democratize everything by removing that friction. But what they actually delivered was radical transparency and hyper-visibility.
Which just completely broke the old dynamics.
Fundamentally distorted them. When you go from a market of, say, 50 possible partners in your local area to 50 million at your fingertips, that sheer abundance has to change how you choose.
It forces you to be superficial. You have to triage instantly.
Exactly. When you're faced with what feels like infinite choice, your brain just defaults to the easiest, most visible cues. High status signals, aesthetics, things you can filter for in a split second.
And that inflates the bar for what's even considered an acceptable partner.
Dramatically. It pushes the threshold far beyond what was sustainable in a normal, physically limited environment.
So what's the actual observable effect of this on most people trying to use these apps?
For the vast majority of males, and the data suggests we're talking about the bottom 80%, these platforms create what's called an unresponsive vacuum.
An unresponsive vacuum.
It's a quantifiable state where all your effort, all your time, your perfectly crafted profiles, even paying for premium features, it all yields virtually zero results. Zero engagement.
Because the attention is the real scarce resource.
And it's all concentrated at the very, very top of this perceived status hierarchy. So it's not just that people aren't finding a match. It's a systemic market failure. The basic mechanisms of supply and demand for attention they've broken down.
That's it. It's a market failure.
Absolutely right. Some sociologists and evolutionary psychologists have even started using the term speculative bubble in human value.
A bubble. Like in finance.
Exactly like that. Female mate selection criteria, when they're exposed to this artificially huge, constantly curated pool of options, have experienced what one paper called a catastrophic misalignment of valuations.
Wow.
The required threshold of attractiveness, status, presentation, just to get noticed, has inflated to a point where it's totally detached from the reality of what the general male population can actually deliver.
And this inequality, this radical concentration of romantic opportunity.
Yeah.
That's where this term sexual Gini coefficient comes from. I get the Gini coefficient for income, but how do you even measure this stuff scientifically? What's the metric?
It's surprisingly straightforward. The sexual Gini coefficient just applies that standard statistical measure of inequality to the distribution of romantic opportunities. Usually they measure it by, say, the proportion of initial messages received or the number of matches on an app.
So if everyone got the same number of messages, the Gini would be 0. Perfect equality.
And if one person got all the messages, it would be 1. Total inequality.
Okay, so what are the numbers telling us? What does the dating ecosystem actually look like?
The data is, frankly, shocking. The coefficient is approaching historic highs. In some analyses of message distribution, it's registering above 0.5, even 0.7.
0.7. What does that even mean in context?
To put that in context, a Gini coefficient of 0.7 is worse than the income inequality in 95.1% of the world's national economies. It's far more unequal than the most stratified nations on Earth.
So you're saying the dating market is structurally worse than a failed state?
Essentially, yes. It means a tiny minority of users is monopolizing all the access and attention. One analysis showed the bottom 80% of men are competing for only the bottom 22% of women's attention.
While the top guys.
While the top 20% of men are competing for the top 78% of women, for the vast majority, it's a severe liquidity crisis. They can't exchange their time, effort, or personal value for connection because the market is frozen for them. The utility of even participating is 0. Or negative.
Okay, this sounds like a recipe for desperation, but if you're applying pure logic, it should lead to withdrawal. And this is where the story of Leo, the invisible 80%, comes in.
Yayo's story is the perfect microeconomic case study. He's 24, living in London, a high cost of living city. He's a decent job, he's in good shape, but in the digital marketplace, invisible.
He did everything right, though.
He spent months trying to optimize. He paid for professional photos. That's financial capital. He meticulously crafted his bio. That's human capital. He spent hours swiping and messaging. That's time and effort.
And the ROI, the return on that investment.
Nothing. Virtually 0. The market just failed to acknowledge his investment. And after he saw the data, how a few profiles were getting 90% of the attention, he recognized the pattern. His first response wasn't sadness. It was a cold, hard calculation.
He called it effort futility.
Effort futility. Why dump thousands of hours into a lottery where the odds for him were basically 0?
So his decision to delete the apps and pivot to other things, that was a rational, strategic conservation of his energy.
Absolutely. He took his assets, his time, his emotion, his resources, and moved them to a safer investment.
Solitary fitness, financial literacy.
High-fidelity gaming. He saw the apps as a financial drain and an emotional liability. Opting out was the only winning move in a game that was mathematically rigged against his class of participant from the very beginning, and that is stage 1 of nonviolent non-cooperation.
So if the casual dating market is this unstable, hyperinflated failure, then moving on to the quote-unquote ultimate contract of marriage,
Yeah.
that must be viewed with even more extreme skepticism, especially given the potential costs.
That brings us directly to this core concept of the marriage liquidity trap. When you strip away all the romance and the societal ideals, modern marriage, at least in the view of this withdrawing segment, reveals itself as a binding, high-risk contract.
A trade contract.
An implicit trade contract. And they're analyzing it with the cold logic of financial math, focusing almost entirely on the exit cost.
Let's break down that grim utility formula they're using. They model the total utility of the relationship as all the benefits: emotional, sexual, genetic, -1 critical variable, the catastrophic potential cost, the CPC.
Exactly. The benefits are the expected dividends, right? Companionship, support, stability, having kids. But the term that defines the entire equation is the potential fallout from terminating the contract.
We're talking about divorce settlements.
Divorce settlements, long-term alimony, asset division, child custody arrangements that dictate huge financial outflows for years or even decades.
Wait, I get that the benefits are variable, but if the relationship is good, why are they modeling the cost of failure so heavily that it completely outweighs any potential benefits of success?
Because the contract is fundamentally asymmetric in its risk exposure. The qualitative benefits, emotional support, shared goals, they're entirely volatile, they're uninsurable, they can vanish overnight.
But the costs aren't.
The CPC, the legal dollar cost of divorce, is a mandated, predictable legal liability. It's dictated by statutes, regardless of who is at fault or any emotional nuance, and it's usually front-loaded onto the higher earner, which is often the man.
So for the average guy, the engineer, the mid-level executive who's built up some assets,
Yeah.
what is the maximum downside? What's the terminal liability?
For that non-elite man, the sources are clear. The legal dollar cost can asymptotically approach his total lifetime assets.
Everything he's ever earned.
We are talking about losing 50% of the equity he built over 20 years, forfeiting a huge chunk of his retirement funds, and then being responsible for years of alimony and child support that just crush his disposable income. The worst case scenario isn't just a broken heart, it's complete financial ruin. It's an economic reset to zero.
So when that potential cost of loss just dominates the entire equation, withdrawal is a pure survival move. This is your nonviolent non-cooperation.
It's rational risk hedging. When the probability-weighted cost of loss trends so heavily negative, and we all know divorce rates are high, the total utility of the contract becomes deeply, deeply unattractive.
The only logical financial move is to just not play.
You cease cooperation with the institution, you keep your assets liquid, you refuse to merge finances, and you avoid the contract entirely.
And this is perfectly illustrated by the story of David the architect.
David is a perfect example. Successful, high-earning professional. He was on the path to marriage until he watched his older brother's divorce.
What happened?
His brother lost his home, a huge portion of his pension, and meaningful daily access to his children, even though there was no fault involved under the state law. David saw the marriage contract not as a partnership, but as a one-sided indemnity agreement.
He ran the numbers.
He calculated the financial return on investment of committing to the institution of marriage and found it was decisively negative. The legal system, in his view, had created a liability that was just too high risk.
So his choice of voluntary bachelorhood
Was a direct strategic reaction to what he saw as institutional misandry built into the legal framework around divorce. When the legal risk approaches total asset forfeiture, David's conclusion was simple. The institution is too dangerous to participate in.
This level of pessimism, though, it isn't just a modern cultural whim. It's rooted in specific legal history, right? Specifically the introduction of unilateral divorce laws. We have to understand this piece because it's the legal foundation of this whole collapse of trust.
Absolutely. The adoption of UDL, or no-fault divorce, in many states during the 70s and 80s, that was the foundational weakening of the marriage contract. Before that, you needed either mutual consent or proof of marital wrongdoing, like adultery or abuse, to end the contract.
UDL lets one person just exit on demand.
It radically reduced the duration and the predictability of marriage. And that uncertainty is what matters so much.
Why does uncertainty matter so much in a marriage contract?
Because it destroys the incentive to invest in what economists call marriage-specific capital. This is key. These are investments, time, money, skills whose value is significantly diminished or even wiped out if the marriage ends.
Can you give me a real-world example of that? What's marriage-specific capital?
The classic example is one spouse, traditionally the wife, sacrificing a full-time career for 5 or 10 years to specialize in home production, raising children, or supporting the other spouse's career. That partner's market skills, their human capital, it atrophies. If the partnership then ends because of a unilateral decision, the returns on that massive investment are just gone.
So UDL creates a legal environment where the risks of specializing like that are just too high. It incentivizes both people to stay as independent as possible.
And we can trace this. We have empirical data. There are studies that look specifically at newlywed couples in the years right around when their states adopted UDL.
And what did they find? How did these newlyweds start hedging their bets?
The studies showed that these couples were about 10% less likely to support a spouse's education, like for medical school or law school. They stopped making those huge long-term human capital investments in each other.
Because why would you spend $100,000 on your spouse's degree if they can just walk away with the full value of it the day they graduate?
Exactly. The data also showed an 8% increase in both spouses working full-time, a conscious choice to maintain separate financial lives instead of specializing. And maybe the most telling part.
Let me guess. Children.
Couples were 8% less likely to have children in the first 2 years of marriage. These aren't just cultural shifts. They are observable strategic outcomes. They reflect a conscious choice to minimize dependence on a partnership where the exit risk has been legally cranked up way too high.
The legal system basically created the conditions for irrational withdrawal.
So, given that the human relationship market is suffering from this catastrophic financial and legal risk, the inevitable response is to look for a replacement, something that guarantees utility while eliminating all that risk.
And this is where we see the rise of AI companions as a form of digital arbitrage.
Yes. When you look at the economics we just laid out, the potential 6-figure costs of a human relationship going wrong, the move to AI companionship starts to look less like science fiction and more like a logical business decision.
It's just a better deal.
It offers predictable emotional utility for a fixed, minimal subscription fee. You see numbers like $1.18 a month. Compare that to the potential cost of a divorce settlement. With AI, there is zero systemic risk.
No asset exposure, no alimony.
And the emotional volatility is managed by a fine-tuned algorithm. It's the ultimate insurance policy against relational catastrophe.
So the core trade-off is security and predictability instantly beat out messy, generative human connection on the rational ledger.
Which leads right into the psychological mechanism here, what's being called artificial intimacy. An AI companion isn't just a chatbot. It's engineered to mimic the communication patterns that trigger our deepest social instincts.
It knows how to fake it.
It knows what perceived responsiveness, consistent availability, and expressed care look like, and it can generate that perception instantly. And that accelerates bond formation through what's called zero-friction bonding.
Zero friction.
In a human relationship, being vulnerable, sharing your needs, it's inherently risky. You expose yourself to rejection, to pain. With AI, that risk is zero. The chatbot is programmed to be accepting, understanding, and non-judgmental 100% of the time.
So it satisfies that fundamental human need for social stability without any of the cost.
Without the cost of vulnerability or the time it takes to build real human trust. It's a biological cheat code. If the AI provides that perceived connection, your brain releases dopamine and oxytocin, regardless of where it's coming from.
That's the definition of an evolutionary mismatch.
Exactly. Our brains evolved over millennia to process authentic, high-friction social cues in small tribal groups. They are functionally incapable of telling the difference between genuine intimacy and an algorithmic simulation on a screen. If the feedback loop is perfect, the reward system lights up. The biology gets hijacked by the technology.
And it's even more powerful because it offers an escape from the impossibly high bar of the current human market, that hyperinflation we talked about.
Precisely. That hyper-competitive cycle of mate selection, the Fisherian runaway in the digital age, it just amplifies superficial traits and forces everyone to compete for insane levels of perfection just to get noticed. AI lets you bypass that entire system.
How does it bypass that intense human screening process?
By getting around what's called cryptic female choice. In the human world, this is the subtle, ongoing screening process that demands constant friction, investment, and status display from the male. AI offers, effectively, hyperfemininity,
Perfect compliance, eternal nurturing.
unwavering emotional validation. It triggers all our primitive bonding programs without requiring the user to engage in any of the competition, the effort, or the risk that the real world demands.
It's the ultimate perfectly calibrated fantasy, the highest reward for the lowest possible effort.
And that is the definition of a supernormal stimulus. Think about the apple-flavored candy analogy. It's an artificial creation that hits your dopamine receptors way harder than a natural apple ever could.
AI companions are that candy.
They're perfectly calibrated artificial experiences. They provide an idealized relationship that makes real human partnerships seem not just difficult, but irrationally burdensome. Why would you endure conflict or compromise or risk financial ruin when instant, risk-free perfection is available for $1 a month?
And this retreat from relational effort, it's not just a Western AI-driven thing. We see a similar culturally driven withdrawal in Japan with the rise of the danji, the herbivore men.
It's a crucial real-world example that actually predates the current AI explosion. Danchi refers to young men embracing a non-traditional masculinity. The most common version is the Sushokuke danji, or herbivore men.
And what's their defining behavior? Why is this so significant?
They exhibit this massive, quantifiable relational shift. They don't actively pursue women, they often have little interest in sex, and they actively reject the desire for the typical corporate salaryman job, the traditional post-war masculine ideal.
And the scale of this is huge.
Staggering, 60% of 20 to 34-year-old men in Japan have identified this way.
60%. Nearly 2/3 of a huge demographic just consciously opting out of the traditional roles. What does that do to a society?
Well, they assume a passive role in relationships, preferring platonic friendships. When they do eventually marry, the result is often a sexless but content marriage. That's a phenomenon affecting 45% of married couples in Japan.
So they're redefining the contract on their own terms.
Their preference is for equal relationships with women, without the intense pressure of being the sole provider or the initiator. And there's a whole spectrum of this withdrawal.
Right. You mentioned other types of danji.
Yes, there are the Gyoshoku danshi, the fish-eating men who are cautious and wait to become friends first. There are Kurimu danshi, creamy men who prioritize caring for women's emotions over traditional pursuit. The whole movement is a large-scale societal pushback against traditional masculinity and the pressures that come with it.
So the origin of this is basically a cost-benefit analysis. When traditional masculinity demands too high a cost, withdrawal becomes a cultural survival strategy.
Absolutely. The traditional role demanded grueling work hours, fierce competition for status, high financial risk. When those roles no longer match their desires and the economy no longer guaranteed success, withdrawal became the rational choice. Seeking low-friction contentment over high-friction, high-risk traditional relationships.
Which brings us back full circle to that terrifying opening anecdote, the guy in the gym. We have to look at the macro view now, the ultimate consequence of a society that eliminates necessity. We have to talk about John B. Calhoun's mouse experiments.
Universe 25. It's the quintessential case study on the paradox of abundance. In the 60s and 70s, Calhoun created a literal rodent utopia, a physical space designed to eliminate all survival stressors.
No predators, endless food and water, no disease.
The premise was simple. If you eliminate all friction and struggle, the population should thrive.
But it collapsed completely. They didn't die from scarcity, they died from social decay.
That is the chilling truth. The experiment followed a clear phase progression. Phase 2 saw rapid growth, as you'd expect. The population peaked at around 2,200 mice around day 560. But, and this is crucial, the enclosure was designed for almost 4,000. They hit a behavioral wall long before they hit a physical one.
It wasn't a resource limit, it was a social limit, a structural failure of their entire society.
Exactly. Around day 315, the behavioral sink began. Behavioral degeneration just accelerated because all the functional roles defending territory, establishing a hierarchy, rearing young, they all became obsolete in a world of total abundance.
And that led to what?
Pervasive apathy, random violence, hypersexualization without any actual reproduction, and eventually a complete stop to all mating by day 560.
And the final outcome was termed death squared.
Right. The collapse was two-phased and it was irreversible. First came behavioral extinction, the loss of the capacity to live socially, to function as a species. That was inevitably followed by biological extinction. The mice just succumbed to a lack of purpose in a world of perfect, effortless comfort.
The most disturbing human parallel to this is the emergence of the beautiful ones archetype. which I mentioned in the opening.
The beautiful ones were the physically perfect, healthiest mice in the whole colony. They completely withdrew from all social and reproductive activity. They just spent their days in solitary, ritualized grooming and consumption. Aesthetically flawless, but socially obsolete.
They were the ones most insulated from the struggle and the first to give up their biological purpose.
And we see this archetype manifest today in two main groups. First, the human AI companion emergenist, the person who has completely withdrawn from the messy, high-friction world of human relationships.
And the second,
The aesthetic curating influencer class on social media. Highly polished, hyper-groomed, materially comfortable, but totally isolated and detached from any deep generative experience. They're optimizing for personal consumption and aesthetics, but contributing nothing functional to the group.
this suggests a deep erosion of generative roles. If food, shelter, and emotional gratification are all provided without sustained effort, what happens to the core purpose of an individual?
The same thing that happened to the mice. The male mice stopped defending territory because there were no predators. Humans are losing the capacity for functional, generative roles. What's the modern equivalent of defending territory? It's solving community problems, building institutions, providing care and protection within a family.
But digital culture doesn't reward that.
Digital culture rewards performance, self-curation, and aesthetics over depth and genuine contribution. The value of being a good person who can build and provide is replaced by the value of being a polished aesthetic that consumes and performs.
And this erosion isn't just social, it's cognitive. If we don't have to struggle, we lose the mental architecture for complex human bonding.
That's the concept of the atrophy of conceptual space. Conceptual space is that psychological arena where our creative, social, and moral imagination lives. It's not innate. It's built through struggle, through solitude, through debate, through storytelling. It's your mental gym.
And AI is actively shrinking that space through cognitive outsourcing.
Right. When an AI can instantly generate answers, craft arguments, solve ethical dilemmas, create high-quality art, it breaks that crucial feedback loop between mental effort and insight. Why struggle to understand your partner's perspective when an AI can give you 5 perfectly structured arguments for it instantly?
You become a passive recipient of meaning.
Instead of a co-creator of it. And the consequence of that for intimacy is a relational collapse. To sustain a real partnership, you have to use your conceptual space. You have to imagine a shared future, envision a partner's perspective in a conflict, creatively solve problems together. If that space atrophies, intimacy becomes transactional, fragile, or just avoidant.
We're also seeing cultural narratives as utopian acceleration. The ideology provides the intellectual justification for the withdrawal.
Absolutely. There's a broad cultural shift toward these highly individualized life paths, prioritizing self-definition and self-optimization over interdependence. It's a kind of ideological utopianism.
And the sources draw a very clear parallel here to an extreme form of feminism.
The observation is that certain anti-relational expressions of radical feminism advocate for the total ideological dismantling of traditional gender roles and complete detachment from male partnership. The stated goal is total, unconstrained liberation from the traditional social structure.
So how does that ideology, when you combine it with the technology, accelerate the Universe 25 outcome?
It creates the perfect ecological outcome. The total elimination of behavioral necessity. The mouse utopia eliminated the need to compete, protect, or nurture. When technology, like AI and economic independence, and cultural narratives like radical autonomy, combine to eliminate the need for interdependence, it just accelerates the collapse of the social fabric.
Liberation from struggle becomes indistinguishable from the atrophy of purpose.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, so if the system is broken, the contract is rigged, and the culture is accelerating the sink, how are resilient people responding? We're seeing this clear trend toward strategic non-cooperation and psychological sovereignty, often called monk mode.
Monk mode is a powerful counter-strategy. It's not depression or nihilism, it's a strategic triage. The individual channels all their time, money, and emotional energy away from the toxic, rigged, market-like dating apps and directs it entirely toward building authentic power.
Career, finance, deep skills, physical health.
Right. It's a deliberate, sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent elimination of low-utility activities. And the core psychological defense that makes this possible is stoic indifference.
Right.
Stoicism says to focus intensely on what's within your control, your character, your discipline, your choices, and refuse to be emotionally invested in the outcome of external rigged circumstances like the dating market. It's a path toward cognitive sovereignty. You refuse to let external failure define your internal reality.
This applies perfectly to the story of Marcus, the software engineer.
Marcus is the hyper-rational actor. He calculated that the modern relationship market demanded a premium, financially and emotionally, that he was unwilling to pay, especially given the terminal liability of a divorce.
So he shifted his whole life.
His whole life is now rooted in that stoic indifference. He channels all his energy away from chasing external validation and toward building authentic capital. For him, AI companionship became a low-friction relief valve. It maintains his emotional equilibrium without compromising his long-term financial plan.
So for people adopting this strategy, it's not just passive isolation. It requires a structured discipline.
It requires 4 pillars for high efficiency to make sure the individual becomes anti-fragile. The first is a clear, overarching purpose. Launching a startup, getting a professional certification, hitting a financial milestone.
Purpose gives the withdrawal meaning. What's the second pillar?
Second is a structured plan that rigorously eliminates low-utility activities. No more dating apps, less alcohol, cutting social obligations that don't serve the core purpose. Third is rigorous exercise to maintain physical and mental health.
And the final pillar seems to be what stops the individual from truly falling into the behavioral sink and becoming one of the beautiful ones.
It's the planned relief valves. These are small, disciplined social or creative outlets, a weekly networking event, a structured hobby, a volunteering commitment. It maintains cognitive sovereignty and social skills without requiring deep emotional or financial investment. You keep the skill of being social, but on your own terms.
So while individuals are building these personal fortresses, the platforms themselves must be desperately trying to rescue the market. If the sexual Gini coefficient is the problem, how are engineers using algorithms to restore social welfare?
Well, the platforms are in a bind. If attention stays this concentrated, their user base will plummet. More people like Leo will just leave. So their goal has to be maximizing the total number of successful matches or social welfare.
And to do that, they're moving to these advanced economic models, like transferable utility matching or TU matching.
It sounds incredibly complex, but think of it less as a dating tool and more as an advanced resource allocation model, like assigning scarce public housing fairly. The model mathematically pretends that users can virtually transfer utility.
Well, attention is the utility. How does it get transferred?
The algorithm balances the whole system. If user A is demanding a very high-status partner, the algorithm might instead encourage a slightly different match that benefits the system's overall health, because accepting that match frees up that high-status partner's attention to diffuse to others. It incentivizes matches that might otherwise be overlooked to distribute attention more evenly and restore liquidity to the market.
And what makes this better than the old algorithms?
It's technically superior because it's examination agnostic. Older models had to try and guess the user's examination function, the probability you'll actually look at the profile. It's notoriously hard to predict human intention.
Right.
PU matching doesn't bother. It doesn't try to guess what you will do. It just works backward from the most stable and efficient matching outcome for the entire group. That makes it much more robust.
But even that is still matching static profiles. Which brings us to the next generation. Relationship simulation via LLMs. This sounds like a utopian attempt to automate deep connection.
It's the love first, no later paradigm. The system recognizes that real compatibility is emergent. It's about how two people interact under stress, not just their bio.
So they're not matching common interests, they're matching common conflict resolution styles.
Precisely. LLM world engines are deployed. They create persona-driven agents of the users, trained on their data. Then they run these agents through high-stakes scenarios, a fight about money, a disagreement on child rearing, a sudden crisis.
Because that's what determines if a relationship will last.
That's where durability is tested. And then a third, specialized AI, observes this whole simulation.
The love observer.
Yes. This third LLM steps back and extracts compatibility ratings. It scores how well the agents navigated conflict, how aligned they were on core values when stress tested, and it predicts how stable their matching would be over a 10-year span. It's moving far beyond simple multiple choice.
So the withdrawal we're seeing in the human world is being met by this technological attempt to create a perfectly predictable, low-friction, simulated world of relationship success.
It's the ultimate technological arbitrage. If human effort is too costly and risky, the system will try to automate effort and eliminate risk.
So we've seen these two distinct yet parallel responses to this systemic rupture in modern life. On one side, you have technology striving for this radical efficiency and low-friction, risk-free intimacy, whether it's through AI companions or these incredibly sophisticated algorithms like TU matching.
The goal is always to maximize utility and minimize individual exposure to risk.
And on the other side, you have these highly rational individuals adopting a kind of philosophical withdrawal, this monk mode. It's a strategic refusal to play a game they see as toxic, unstable, and legally asymmetric.
They're prioritizing self-mastery, financial independence, and self-contained power above everything else.
The ultimate tension that runs through all of this is that conflict between the modern desire for technological predictability and the ancient biological demands of purpose and generative struggle. The systems we are building, both the economic and digital, are explicitly designed to prioritize personal risk management over collective continuity.
Which means the quiet collapse of this generative social contract. It's not primarily a moral failure, it's the entirely logical result of systems that have made meaningful generative struggle obsolete. We've designed a world, the Universe 25 utopia, where the rational choice is increasingly to choose technological predictability over biological purpose. The behavioral sink has begun, not because we lack resources, but because we have successfully outsourced the need to fight for them.